Welcome to CaCo Talks, the weekly podcast where conversations about life, hot topics, mental health, and more take center stage. We are your hosts, Catelyn and Courtney Geiger.
Together, we explore thought-provoking discussions with an ambient vibe that inspires open and honest dialogue. So sit back, relax, and join us for some insightful conversation that will leave you feeling informed and inspired.
Welcome back to CaCo Talks. Tonight we are discussing, or really debating rather, I guess, the origins of African American culture, or like where should we consider our homeland, basically. I had this thought the other day, or really I was watching somebody's TikTok, and they were talking about how as African Americans, we have this notion that we need to travel back to Africa, basically, or go back to an African nation to like discover our homeland, to feel like we are, amongst our people. And but that got me thinking, like, is that really our homeland as people who are born and raised and have generationally lived in America? Is that really our homeland? And is there some sort of tension between us as African American people and the people of various African nations? So that's a discussion we're going to have. Catelyn and I have differing opinions and interest levels in the topic, but I figured that would be a good place to start. Maybe we can dig into the discussion. There's a poem that I'm actively still trying to find that I want to read because it's really it's probing. It was written a long time ago, but it is probing. So yeah. Anyway, let's hear Catelyn's thoughts about it, because we did have a discussion on it and we have differing levels of opinions on the origins of our African American, I guess, homeland.
So I think that I personally am not qualified to speak for like the whole of African Americans. I think it depends on the person personally. And so that's why we have a bit of an issue, is I don't really feel like there's much for me to contribute to this conversation, because I can only speak for myself, not for the whole of African Americans. Personally speaking, I think that the origin is rooted in Africa. That's where we would have been living if we were not brought over here by slaves, unless we chose to come over here, and then we would consider ourselves to be Africans. Because we were pretty much brought into slavery to America, I don't think you can consider that your home, personally speaking.
I mean, I think that's valid. I'm not saying that that's not valid. And I think that's how a lot of people think. They think like going to, let's say a West African nation, which is like more likely where we would have, theoretically, our like lineage would go back to. But the thing there is, like, in that nation, they have their own, there's a rupture that we can't deny that I think that slavery caused. You know what I'm saying? Like, there was a direct rupture that we all know historically happened because of the slave trade. So that it really became an us and them right there because of that. And when there's so many problems with that rupturing and so many issues with that history, and we're not saying that rupture should have ever happened, but it did. And it did. Not only were they erasing identity of the individual enslaved people, but they were erasing culture. They were erasing they were erasing lineage. They were erasing heritage. They were erasing nationality. They were erasing names.
Everything that person or
And
culture
they were
was.
exactly. They erased everything that person was, and in doing so, I think we think of it as this like negative thing, because it's like, oh, they erased, they got rid of, they whatever. But then also, an erasure became a new culture. Now, I'm not saying that culture was like founded, it wasn't organically founded by the people themselves, which would be the most ideal situation. But because of that rupture, when there was nothing, they created something here. And
but I feel like that ties back to Africa.
I think it has some ties to Africa, but I think what I personally like to think of is my lineage starts with as an African American, because that rupture, that wiping away of an identity, and then the the enslaved people who came over here created something new.
Well, then you
That
can say that about like appropriation then. Because somebody taking what you have and making it their own, if you will. Like,
taking something that has
no.
already that didn't originate from them. It's like there's a
Hmm.
difference between who it originated from. I'm talking about something that originated with enslaved people.
Yeah, but if it was erased, then did it originate?
It was erased. So they created
I mean, the
something
African
new.
culture was erased
Yeah, they
or
created something
attempted.
new in America. It's like, okay, so like when I think about African American culture, I'm thinking about like things like chitlins or um
But that was by force. That is not culture.
I know it's by force, but they created something out of that force. That's what I'm trying to honor. I'm trying to honor what was created despite.
Mm-mm. I'm not here for it. I mean, I hear what you're trying to say, but like, no. Like, that to me, that's not
I
honor.
think
Like,
there's, I think it's strength. I mean, because I think it's just as dismissive to say, well, then to me, you are honoring. If you dismiss the work they put into building a culture, you're
that's what I'm saying.
dismissing the work.
I don't think there was intentional work in that. They were trying to pretty much survive. And
Yes.
I think
But
to
should
be
we
like, oh,
dismiss survival?
let's say we're Americans or African Americans and our home is the South is extremely dismissive from the trauma of being ripped from your home and what everything that you knew and being like, oh no, you're American.
I
Like,
think
no, and I think that's why Americans or African Americans feel lost in America is because there is a level of what am I? America doesn't accept you, nor does Africa. Nobody accepts you.
I hear that. There's actually a poet that I want to find. I'm gonna try to find it over the course of this episode. It's by Claude McKay. It talks about being in between, feeling like you belong to no one
Mm-hmm.
because you are of no. You're not at home in your homeland. You're not at home in America. You are just
Mm-hmm.
you're like a black
Body.
person walking
Yeah.
around in the world. And there's this idea of non-origin to black people. That
Mm-hmm.
our origin is so muddled, and it was purposely muddled. What
Mm-hmm.
I'm saying is, and I guess this is where we get off, is I feel like with the rupture, there's a strength in surviving that, and by this we can't dismiss that there are people, our direct lineage, who, if they did not survive, my mother would not have been here, our grandmothers would not have been here, our great
I
grandmothers
mean,
would not
I
have been
hear
here.
that, and I'm not saying that there's not strength in
I just
surviving,
don't
but
want
I
to
do
dismiss it.
think it's slightly dismissive to be like, well, now you created a culture. The intent was not to create a culture. Was that possibly produced out of that? Sure. But and then to be like, oh, the South is your home or that's your origin. It's not. The South is not
I'm
your
talking about
origin.
for the people, for descendants of American chattel slavery, people who are descendants of that institution.
Okay, even if you are a descendant, though, right? There
So
is a
would you
part
still
of
come?
you that.
Go
Hmm?
ahead. Go ahead. Go
There's a
ahead.
part of you that is still connected to that lineage of what was ripped away.
Yes, I agree with that. I'm not saying that needs to be totally dismissed. I just think in our culture too much we totally act like the American slave system that happened in the South, where we come from, that should not be honestly celebrated. Like, we need to celebrate the people who survived that.
Okay, that's why. And maybe the people that survived it, but they'd be like, "Oh, your
No, I'm
culture
not. We're
comes
not.
from X, Y, and Z." That's wild
No,
to
I'm
me.
not saying. I want to make it very clear. I'm not saying celebrate the institution of slavery itself. That was a horrific
But I
institution.
think that's what celebrating the South as being your home is implying.
I don't think that's what that's implying at all. I'm
It
talking about the
is.
survivors. I'm
But
talking
even
about
if you
survivors.
survived it, because there's a difference between like coming over here and creating white culture, right, versus like European culture. You had a choice in the culture that you created. Period. Cool. As a slave or as an African American, what we are today, you did not have a choice in that.
I
You
just
didn't
think
have a choice in that.
it's equally dismissive to say, oh, there is no culture in the American South where African Americans,
I'm
the
not saying
institution
there
of
is
slavery
no
happened.
culture, but you can't.
Because
I don't think you
the
can
truth
say that's
is,
home.
well, where
That's
is our
wild.
home?
I don't think we have a home. We're
So
homeless.
if our home is in isn't in Africa because we can't go to Africa.
You think you could be here?
We were
You're only
born
here, but
here.
yeah, we were born here. But the only reason why you're here, and let's be honest here, that's not even fully accepted, is because of slavery and the institution of slavery and making sure that there's this hierarchy when it comes to
I'm
white
just
people versus black
confused.
people.
And I'm saying this right. I think that's the issue people have a hard time like wrapping their mind around. And it took me a while to wrap my mind around it too, because I was like, well, we should go back to Africa. We should all just, that's our homeland. Africa is our homeland. That's where we come from. But I think we cannot deny that there was a rupture in that the institution of slavery happened not by choice, and it's not that it should have happened, and that was a horrific institution. But I think it's equally as dismissive, and we'd be just as dismissive as the white people, in my opinion, to act like the culture that came out of the institution of slavery for African Americans, for people who were enslaved, that culture does not have value, because it does.
What culture? Like, give me some examples
African
of culture.
American culture has value.
Okay, sure, but
Black
like,
American
what are
culture
some
has value.
specific examples
Okay, so like for
linked
example,
to slavery?
the tall tales like Brer Rabbit or folk tales, right? And then you get into people who actually fought back against slavery, like somebody like Harriet Tubman or Nat Turner, right? Or we can get into things like jumping the broom, okay? That kind of thing. As well as like even certain foods we eat, like chitlins, okay? Even if you don't like
But that
chitlins.
culture, that all of that culture is rooted out of, I mean, force.
I realize that.
Like
I'm
I'm just like
not even
I
looking
can't
at
call
things.
that culture. That's not like that's
So
not
you don't
I
consider
don't
that. So
know.
that's not Black culture. None of that is
I mean,
Black culture.
I see how it relates to Black culture, but to me, more than anything, it's like turning trauma into culture, and that's not, to me, that's like very dismissive.
I don't think that's dismissive at all. To
It is like
celebrate
eating chitlins. They were
somebody's
eating chitlins because they
struggle.
had no fucking choice.
And
No,
so,
I bet you those people did not want to
I
eat
just feel like
chitlins.
I feel like it's looking down. Like, oh, I'm not saying that they were not forced to do it, and I'm not saying that they should be dismissed because they survived. Like, are we not going to honor their survival?
I mean, we can honor their survival without like there is this level of, especially with African Americans, I think because there is a lot of confusion with what is origin, what's not origin. People like a lot of people associate the culture of African Americans, or not even associate, the culture of African American is rooted in trauma, period.
Yes.
And that's the only community that is really rooted in that. So I think it's
I just feel
dismissive to
like
call that culture. Like, it's like, let's call it what it is. It's a trauma response. Like, eating chitlins was not something I'm sure they wanted to do. They had no choice but to eat it. Just like the spirituals and things that you were saying that they sung those because they were trying to stay in contact with maybe their spirituality, or those were spirituals to navigate, getting out of slavery and things like that. Like, to be like, oh, I mean, they're all fun and games now, but then it wasn't fun and games. That's how they survived.
Okay, I hear that. And I'm not saying that is not, we're not going to deny that trauma is the root cause of this. I don't think either one of us are denying that trauma is the root cause of this. I'm saying, how do we look at that trauma and how we've progressed? Because Black culture that's how it started, right? That was the initial reaction. The initial, I don't want to say reaction, but the initial um, culture that was created out of that trauma, right? Was the spirituals, the tall tales, the folk tales, the the kind of informal marriage ceremonies. All this stuff is rooted out of trauma, right? But think about, okay, decades go past, then what? What's our culture now? So the culture that we create now, where is that rooted? It's not Africa.
I still disagree. Like, I feel like there's a lot of things that can be tied back to that. Like, even though that the African culture they attempted to erase it, there's a lot of things that still go back to that.
So what I'm thinking about now is like, okay, when I think about Black culture, African American culture, which is how I show up in the world, is as a Black American woman.
Yeah, but because that's what you were told you had to be, though.
Yes, but I'm saying what is also the rupture that's also missing is, okay, but I couldn't go to, like, I don't know, Sierra Leone and, like, be a part of that culture. I don't know. I
I
have no
mean,
upbringing. I
you would
have
have to
no
learn that
history. I have no
culture. Okay, cool.
nationality. I don't have the language. I have none of it.
Okay, cool. Yeah, and that's because that was ripped away from you. It's just like if you go
Historically,
to,
yes, it was. But the also thing is, can I not also be proud of what I do have?
I
Like,
mean, I think you
that's
can
my
be
issue.
proud
Is
of it.
like, I'm like, the issue to me is this: is like, in saying, oh well, it started from trauma. It's rooted in trauma. People are dismissive of, like, oh, it doesn't mean anything because it was a trauma response. And to me, I look at it as, it was a trauma response, but somebody said, you know what, despite the trauma, we're surviving. That should be honored, is the decision to survive. That needs to be honored.
And how is that not being honored?
It's not being honored by saying, you know what, that culture is actually rooted in Africa, because if we really just should just ignore that trauma happened and that you created something beautiful out of that trauma and go actually back to Africa.
But what I
That's it,
think that
ignoring
you're failing to
it.
realize is that those decisions were not created out of being beautiful. Those decisions were created out of,
Something beautiful
this is
happened
what,
because of it.
I
Did it
mean.
not?
Maybe is
So
it?
you don't consider black American culture beautiful?
Um, it depends on what you're talking about.
Okay.
Yeah,
I
I
didn't
think it
realize we
depends on
had
what you're
such
talking about.
different opinions on this.
Yeah, and that's not like, I don't want to seem like America has not contributed in some way, but I for the life of me, I can't. It's hard to get past the like appreciating this culture that is so rooted in something's trying to destroy something else to its entirety. Like I like every piece of something, and you call that culture? I don't think that's culture. To me, that's brainwashing. I'm telling you what you have to do. That's not culture. And I think it's very
So
interesting that you're like, oh yeah, we should appreciate the South. And it's like, the South honestly could throw you out right now. And you're talking about appreciate the South? The South really would appreciate going back to slavery and having you enslaved and doing the same thing over again.
I just feel like it's dismissive.
I mean, you can call it dismissive. I think it's very dismissive to be
I
like, the
think it's
South
also,
is
I mean,
this
because
saving grace, has gave us this culture, and it's like,
I'm not
the
saying it's a
South didn't
saving
do
grace.
that.
It's recognizing the trauma that happened and understanding that
And then
nobody's
dismissing it.
denying that there was trauma. What I'm saying is, to me, what gets dismissive is when you say, okay, we're gonna look at our homeland strictly as Africa and not acknowledge the fact that so much of our culture actually comes from things that were developed out of the institution of slavery, and that rupture itself created or really forced the enslaved people to create a new culture that we are descendants of. We are descendants of that new culture, whether you like to admit it or not. I mean, okay, let's take it to our personal story. It's like this. Okay, so we were born to a single mother out of wedlock, right? Which is considered in American culture to be, especially for Black women, to be what, a heinous crime, right? Is to have children and not be married. Does that mean because of the trauma that happened between our mother and our father's relationship that we, the children, are not beautiful children? Because
Say that again.
does that mean that whatever the trauma that happened between our mother and father, that rupture, that situation that happened between our mother and father at circumstances of our birth, and there was trauma with that, we can agree to that, we lived through the trauma of it, that the children who came out of it, me and you, are not beautiful children who have an opportunity and have their own ideas, thoughts, and ability to contribute to the world, and are not beautiful children because of what happened to our parents?
No, but I definitely think that could change your perspective on it.
Because that's like saying because our parents were made out of wedlock, that our culture, we shouldn't even, these two children, they shouldn't even exist. that we need to look past these kids. They mean nothing. Nothing about them is good because of whatever happened between their parents. Throw their lives
No, I
away.
think that's very different.
I don't think it's different at all.
No, it's very different. And I
It's the
think the
same
reason why
mentality.
it's different because I think that when you have children, it's this new thing coming into this world.
That's what the
And
culture was.
but I think the culture is different because there's a different level of autonomy even in today's society versus then it was not that. And then that became everyone's norm as an African American. Versus if you're born in, like, say you're born as a white woman in Europe, right? You know everything about your whatever. No one's trying to brainwash you into anything else or thinking less than of yourself or making you eat something that you normally wouldn't eat or remove your spirituality or be enslaved, being physically abused all day, every day, working relentless hours, not being able to enjoy life to its entirety, being ripped away from your family. I mean, losing your loved ones along the journey, like ripping people's children away. That's culture. Sure, there were some positive things that came out of that, but it to me is a bit of a stretch. Like, people were doing those decisions or making those decisions because they did not have any other choice. And I think it's, to me, very dismissive to be like, oh, let's put this as a pretty present and call this culture. Like, to me, that's what the white man wants you to think.
That's not what I'm trying to do. I want to clarify, because I think what you said in there was interesting about the horrendous trauma that was the institution of American slavery.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. We both agree that that was a horrendous institution that, regardless of how you feel about what the culture, that itself forced enslaved Black people, previously people from African nations, it forced them to survive, number one, but also develop mechanisms and a culture to survive, right? That's what we agreed upon.
You call that culture then?
Historically. What else did they have to survive? That was a part of what they created.
So that's why I don't know if I can call it a culture. Like, a culture is something that you cultivate to grow, it's.
I mean, I think we're thinking of it in romanticized terms here. It's like, I think you think I'm romanticizing the struggle, and I'm not romanticizing the struggle. I'm acknowledging that there was a struggle, but out of that came something that that the people created, that the enslaved people created, despite. That is something I think that should be celebrated. The culture itself, not the horrendous actions of the slavery.
Okay, so what parts of Black culture are you participating in?
I think it has a lot to do with how I show up. Like, okay, for example, hair, right? That's a big thing in our culture.
You don't have a choice in that. And even that
Okay, but it's still cultural.
Okay, but even in that, you have to present a certain way in white America.
Yes.
Okay.
I said that these forces aren't here. But what we're also saying is that still out of that, something was created by black women, Black American people, to survive in white American culture. So
being like the white man is our culture?
No, I'm saying okay, braids, right? Braids, the long braids that everybody's doing now, or that all types of people do. And we see white people try to appropriate it all the time because it has cool points now. Created out of Black culture, right? Cornrows.
Even that's rooted in African culture. That's not an American thing.
I'm pretty sure cornrows came out of African American, came out of enslavement. Like, they were putting corn, they had to put corn in their hair.
I'm pretty sure.
Look it up.
Braids have always been an African thing, though. So that's why I'm I don't.
Let me look it up because I don't want to be wrong. So I'm going to be like,
They date back to 300 BC in Africa.
Okay. So forget the braids.
And this is my point. I'm glad you made that point, because most of these things root back to where. And to be
African
fair, the
nation.
origin of pretty much,
I'm
I
not
think,
saying that it's not. I'm not saying that it's not rooted in Africa, because they took what they knew in Africa and brought it
sure.
over, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's tied to that in some ways. But I think, okay, well then how do you explain? I guess that's what I'm trying to understand is how do you explain why I can't go to, like I said, Sierra Leone right now and be a part of their culture? How do you
Because I
explain that?
think because you have been ripped away from that culture, now you do not know, or you do not have a connection to that culture. If that was
Yes.
not ripped away from you, this
Then what
wouldn't even
culture
be a
am I connected
conversation.
to? Which one am I connected
You're
to?
not connected to anything. And that's the part that I think African Americans struggle with. There is no connection point here in America. There is no connection point in Africa anymore, because that has been severed because of somebody else's choices. And now we are here as a culture of African Americans, and we have to deal with that.
So if we are looking to celebrate something, is it best to celebrate an African nation where we are also not welcomed, really? Or an
I mean,
African
I think it's.
American culture? Because if I go to
I don't
an
think we should
African
celebrate
nation right
culture. I
now,
think we should celebrate African Americans. Cool. I think that's the difference. Like the culture as a whole, it's to me rooted in trauma, and to me, then there's nothing wrong with acknowledging trauma, but to put in a pretty bow and be like, "Oh, you did a good job. Thank you for the
no one
cornrows."
is saying
That's
that.
wild to me.
No one is saying
But
we
that's what
need
you're
to
saying.
celebrate.
And
That's
the
not
thing
what
is,
I'm
that's
saying.
exactly what
I'm
happens on the other
celebrating
end
the
of appropriation.
survivors. The
Even if you're celebrating
survivors.
survivors, okay, well, if we're celebrating survivors, we don't need to celebrate culture then. We can celebrate,
The
Harriet
culture
Tubman,
created out of people
Frederick
who
Douglass. We can
survived.
celebrate African American individuals, sure.
It's celebrating the culture out of the people who survived.
But that's what I'm asking you. What is African American culture? Give me some examples of what you're celebrating as an African American today. And you said braids. We X that out. That's African. If you're saying, and I heard you say chitlins before,
music,
that's out of it.
music,
If you,
music.
okay, you said music, but even that is rooted in survival and African things of communicating so people could get out of the slave trade and whatnot.
Not all African American music, like jazz. Jazz was created well after slavery
That
had
was an
ended.
escape mechanism.
No, it wasn't an escape mechanism.
I mean, that was a place of an enjoyment for African Americans outside of what they were dealing with in their day-to-day lives. They would go to like little juke joints and dance and things.
Okay, but that doesn't mean that it's not culture.
That's still rooted out of trauma.
Okay, literature, Harlem Renaissance writers.
Even that's rooted in trauma.
But all of it's not necessarily. I don't know. I refuse. Maybe I'll just die on this hill, and maybe I'll be locked up in whatever cultural prison.
I think sometimes you try to just be the, like, appreciate the good that can come out of these bad situations. And I hear that. I want to be appreciative of that. But that personally just gives the white man the power that they want. And that they're like, well, we did you a solid by creating African American culture and bringing you over here in the first place. I'm like, no.
At no point in this conversation have I said the institution of slavery and the white people are good. I have never said
Well,
that.
I hear that, but I'm saying inadvertently, when you say, hey, this is African American culture because they survived, to me, that's what you're implying.
So
because it's like if they didn't have to make the choice, if they didn't have to make the choice to survive, they never would have had this culture in the first place. We would have been over there in Sierra Leone, period. Unless we wanted to come here.
Or never would have happened.
Sure. But that's my point. So how can you, and not saying that I think appreciating individual people is just a better way to do it, versus saying like, oh, this culture of like African American. A lot of those things are rooted in not intentional growth of African Americans. That was literally because I had no other choice. That's just like, to me, like you being abused as a kid and being like, well, I'm glad that happened to me because now I know how to culturally be a better Black person.
Nobody is saying they were glad that it happened.
But that's what it sounds like.
I want to make sure that that is very clear, that nobody is saying that we're glad that the institution of slavery happened for Black people. That nobody at any point in this conversation has said that, actually, or has implied that they are glad that that institution happened. We're saying, how do we look at ourselves as a culture with that very clear rupture that happened? And you're saying that we need to look past that rupture and say Africa is it. And I'm saying, because the rupture happened, we can look at what had to happen because of that as a culture itself.
What's the definition
That
of culture?
if
Because
if that rupture did not happen, there would be no such thing as like I was saying, the Brer Rabbit tales. Do you know what that is? The Uncle Remus tales. There would be things like the like griots, and even let's think about like New Orleans culture, like voodoo, right? And hoodoo. Okay. Those sorts of
even that's
cultures.
rooted
What
in
you want to say
Africa,
about
though.
that? And it might be taken from that. So maybe what we need to come to the understanding is like maybe Black American culture is derivative.
Okay, this is the definition of culture. It can mean the cultivation associated with civilized habits of mind, the creative products associated with the arts, or the entire way of life associated with a group.
Mm-hmm.
So it's
And
all
then
the
we
ways of
get
life, including
into,
arts, beliefs, and institutional population that are passed down from generation to generation.
and then also, okay, then think about like Southern folklore. I'm thinking about like Zora Neale Hurston, as well as spoken word poetry. Right, you can get into jazz, blues, rap, hip hop, which are now very mainstream forms of music, right? All of that is created by Black Americans, not African peoples. African people born and raised after the institution of slavery, right?
Is it?
Yes, those musical styles.
So the origin of rap is from African Americans.
Yes, hip hop, rap is Black.
Okay.
Rap stands for rhythm and poetry. I don't know if you knew that.
Mm-hmm.
And then you get Black writers like like Zora Neale Hurston, Nella Larson, who else? Obviously Toni Morrison, Maya Angelou, Langston Hughes, County Cullen, all these people, right? And then you even get into people I'm thinking about, what's the lady's name with the hair products? Madam C.J. Walker. You can even get down into people like Oprah or who else? Other like people who've even like existed in Hollywood. Like, I think to add to this conversation, I think something we need to also Nikki Giovanni, Gwendolyn Brooks, but those are writers. But people, there was a concerted effort by white culture at the time that slavery was happening to erase Black culture, right? That we agreed on that. They made a concerted effort to strip identity. Okay. But I think something that has been a lasting effect of that is us not even knowing our own culture as Black American peoples, i.e. people
Or
like
as
non.
Africans, then. Because we were ripped away from something, we were ripped away from our African culture.
Yes, that and so they did a really good, honestly, the white people did a really good job, because we have almost no direct national tie to the African nations that our
There is
descendants are from.
correction. There is no ties whatsoever.
Exactly. So
It's
they
nothing.
did what they intended to do. That's what they did
Which
intend
is
to do. That's
my
what they did.
point. Is dismissive to be like there's Black culture. That's
You want
honoring the
to?
white
I'm
man.
putting a pause on that because I still feel like that's the crux of the debate. But I want to finish what I was saying before.
Okay.
what I was saying before, dang, I lost. What was I even saying before? Because you made me think about that. Let me take a second. Think. Oh, that they have still continued to make a concerted effort so that we don't even know about the Black American people, the culture that, in my opinion, was created after the institution of slavery. So, like what Ron DeSantis is doing with woke books, right? Like getting rid of basically any Black work that is in schools. Um, and in our education system, we only learn about mostly white artists, white people who've created white culture, Western culture. You know, our entire education coming up is mostly white Eurocentric. So we don't even, a lot of us don't even necessarily know about the direct history of people, descendants of American slavery, who have created work, who have created, in my opinion, culture. You know what I mean? Until we do our own deep diving. Like the first time I read a novel by a Black American person I was like 18, and I was reading Toni Morrison for the first time, and that was in like a special class where the rest of the school was not learning that type of material, you know. Um, and we might learn about Maya Angelou, but we learn about those things very sort of peripherally. We don't get into like actual, in my opinion, is African American, descendant of American chattel slavery culture. You know,
I hear you. I hear you.
that's what I'm saying.
And I don't know. And I guess I like, don't be wrong, like my battle with the topic, not topic, or the idea is that like, how do you go about like honoring what has become of like what the end result of slavery now, right? Like what we're dealing with present day, without also being disrespectful in the sense that people were ripped away from their homes and their culture and everything they knew as Africans first. And now we're in this in-between stage as African Americans of not knowing where we're from, what our true culture really is, what home really is, and not even being able to identify with the home that we have been forced to come to, let alone the home we were forced to leave, and making quote unquote a culture out of someone's trauma response. And I think that is constantly perpetuated in the African American community. So I think it's harmful to say that there's this wonderful culture, and it's like there's some very deep things that are rooted in African American cultures that we don't even know the extent of, but we put in a pretty present and call it Black culture.
I'm not trying to romanticize it,
But
but
that's
I'm
what you
saying
end up doing, though. Nonetheless, no matter what your intent is, that is what's happening
I think
for the African American quote unquote culture.
I think okay. So two things can be true at the same time. We agree to that. Yes, that there can be trauma and something beautiful at the same time.
I mean, I hear that. And
I think, and like, or something beautiful can come out of it. Like, all I
sure.
can really relate it to is like I said, the trauma of our birth, our parents, that situation. There was a trauma, and there continued to be trauma after our birth, but that doesn't mean that you and I coming out of it, honestly, we're not a beautiful thing to come out of it, despite the trauma. And honestly, if it wasn't for our mother believing that something beautiful could come out of it, we would have been left in the dust.
I guess.
She could have been hands up. This was a traumatic experience for me. Nothing good can come out of it. This person was traumatic for me. The children coming out of it, nothing good can come of this. But she obviously didn't believe that. There was something about what she said that what she believed was this might have happened to me and happened with me involved or however it happened, but the two individual lives that come out of it can be beautiful lives. And I'm going to put effort into making them
But I'm
beautiful
not
lives.
saying that it cannot be beautiful. That's like not what I'm saying at all. I think it's more about like trying to not be disrespectful to the trauma and also learn to appreciate it. And so that is why I have a hard time calling it culture. Because culture is something that cultivates, to me, like growth and expanding and
Yes,
and
I
betters
agree.
the overall. And it doesn't always have to be in like a strong, like positive light. So that's not what I want to insinuate. But slavery is like, that's wild to me. Like everything about slavery was brutal for the most part.
I agree. I think it was a brutal institution. Nobody's denying that it wasn't a brutal institution. My take on it is that it can't, to me, and even, I mean, you can even take like, quote, what white culture is, right? Even there's brutality to their culture as well.
Sure.
Or the idea of like struggle to their culture. You can take something like the Pilgrims when they were coming over. They didn't have to survive the boat trip. They didn't have to survive being on this land,
So I
right?
have a question, like in relation to this conversation about like Black culture. So
Mhm.
why is there not a white culture then?
I think that there is a white culture.
Oh, okay.
I think what white culture is and has historically been has been a culture that they have made sort of this secret society, like it's omnipresent and we all like succumb to, I don't say succumb to it, but we all are like in some ways I don't choose my word here, but we're all affected by it. That's the word. And but I think what white culture is just not something that we all see as positive. I think white culture a lot of times is tied to colonialism. I think it's a lot of times tied to um like other people's oppression. I think a lot of times it's tied to appropriation, so we don't associate it as being anything positive. But I think there is a white culture. I actually have a theory. I think narcissism comes from white culture.
I don't necessarily agree.
So what do you think?
Like narcissism?
No, just what is white culture? What is American culture?
I think that there is a white culture, and I would probably agree with you and say that it is a culture um, of like almost like elitist, you know? And the thing is, like, to be a part of like white culture, some white people can't even get into that. So it's very
Exactly,
like,
because a
it's
lot of their,
very,
in my
it
opinion,
has to be a certain look.
I agree. I think a lot of white culture is based off of appropriation of other cultures, not even just Black culture, but other cultures
Oh,
as
yeah.
well. And I think the idea of whiteness is honestly, and it is it's inherently racial because we define ourselves by what we are not. We are not Black, so we are white. We are
Mm-hmm.
not Spanish, we are white. We are
Mm-hmm.
not um, Southeast Asian, we are white.
Mm-hmm.
And that concept of whiteness, in my opinion, is tied to
Putting everyone else down.
yeah. That's what I think a lot of white culture, whether they want to admit it or not, is sort of rooted in. And that's why I think it's hard for people to pinpoint because it's an ideology. I don't think
Yeah,
it
and I
is
think
a
that's also why a lot of people don't see it as existing, because it's not necessarily like your typical form of culture, if that's what you want to call it.
yeah.
It's based off of pretty much superiority, inferiority. That's it. That's pretty much it.
Exactly. And then also the other thing too is because when we think about whiteness, we're looking at someone based off of their skin color, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
less whereas, historically it used to be, well, even my skin color is white, but I am French or I
Mm-hmm.
am English. I am tied to this nation. That is where my loyalties lie. That is where my culture comes from. That it was tied to that. But in America, where there was a rupture for them too, right? When they were coming to America, they were seeking refuge or they were seeking business opportunities. So they were rupturing with their old land. It was by choice, but that's what they were doing, right? So when they came over, it became, well, We're white now. We're all white. We're white, and this is an ideology that collectively we, as people who come from this part of the world, Europe, we have an upper hand because we've basically established our superiority due to our skin color and our racial, I guess, identity.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I think about when I think about whiteness, which is sort of, there's something sad about it because it's like, it almost feels like you're missing what culture is.
Exactly. That's why
It feels like it's
I think that's
almost
why
not
people,
one.
and that's what I was gonna say. I think that's why people have a hard time calling it white culture, because it's like, that's not. If you look at culture anywhere else in the world, that's not what it is.
Exactly.
Like, it
And
has
that's why I'm
nothing to
saying,
do with like tearing somebody else down for you to be at the top. And the thing is, like, when you compare yourself to other cultures, you're not even close. But whites think that for whatever reason.
yeah.
Like, they're rich in what? I'm confused.
And I also think
In
too that
monarchies? Like, okay.
I also think too that, and that's why I think I can definitively say that there isn't a African American, a Black American culture, because things that identify with culture have been created out of, as opposed to when you look at what white culture, what we have seen to be white culture, that it lacks some of those things, right?
Mm-hmm.
So as African Americans, at least there's like a music style. There is artwork created out of that. There is, you know, like folklore created out of that, out of that rupturing.
Mm.
What was created out of the rupture of white Americans, besides the idea
Wealth.
of whiteness?
Wealth.
Like, what happened from their tie from Europe to America?
Wealth.
And
What happened?
establishing a racial cultural hierarchy for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
That,
From
in my
that
opinion, is
wealth.
based mostly on, probably on appropriation, as well as just
Brainwashing.
kind of that, like, yeah. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm sure there's certain foods and maybe even like maybe, I guess, styles of dress, I don't know, that come from like European culture. I don't know. I mean, I would love to know what white Americans think of as their culture.
Yeah, same. Because I'm confused.
Because if you
Yeah,
ask people
I don't know what
today,
else to add to that. Like, I don't know what else to add is their culture, to be fair. Like, a lot of
I
the
think,
things that they've participated in are from someone
or maybe
else.
they're just as
So,
lost as us.
and that's what I was going to ask is, like, in comparison to Black culture versus African culture, do you think there is the same divide going on with white culture versus like European cultures? Because I do think those things are different.
I think so, because if you ask anybody like a white person in America, they probably identify more with the region that they come from in America versus America as a whole, and then let alone like the continent of Europe or European nations. I would
Mm-hmm.
say most probably white Americans can't say exactly what part of Europe they come from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, same thing as African Americans. I couldn't tell you where I came from.
And that's why I'm like, maybe we're all just walking around, like, maybe we need to look at this as like, okay, because when America was created, really, America, we got to think back to that time. America was not a nation founded upon people of the same ethnicity, same nationality, none of that. It was lots of people from different places,
Mm-hmm.
all living together on this
Well, I
land.
think even going back further than that, there were people living in and inhabiting America. Typically your Indians,
Native
right?
Americans,
Native Americans,
indigenous
um,
peoples.
yeah, indigenous, like tribes and things like that. So even they were pretty much ripped of their culture too by having Americans come over and teach their ways. But I digress. Um, So why not? Why weren't white Americans able to like grow from that? Like what was going on that they had to demolish anything outside of what they deemed to be white culture and or European culture?
My guess is probably, I mean, I think it goes back to certain European ideas of imperialism and colonialism
Mm-hmm. That's fair.
and honestly capitalism. Um,
Mhm. Which I
I
think
think,
that's why I say like white culture is rooted in wealth. That's really all they cared about was how can I make the most money and exploit whatever it is, to be fair, so that I can make a profit or I can make myself rich. Which is maybe why they don't have a culture.
or why it's hard to pinpoint it, especially as it comes to Americans, because they voluntarily ruptured themselves from European nations, right? And say, we're going to go to America because it's new land, a new opportunity, a new whatever, where we can go basically exploit the resources and the people there.
Yeah, and I think
Um,
even further than that, like to the point of like
so
they
maybe
don't
they have
have
physical.
culture. They don't have culture because all they know is to exploit whatever. So they cannot be like they cannot comprehend being original to any capacity. It's only exploit and take from somebody else. That's it. So maybe that's why there is not a white culture. Does that make sense?
No, I hear that. And that's
Mm-hmm.
an interesting. I would love to know what somebody like a scholar thinks about it. I want to also caveat. I want to say this is Caitlin and Courtney's opinions, the opinions of ourselves, not necessarily shared by everybody else in the world. But and we're
Mm-hmm.
not also saying that this is fact and true, but this is something to think about.
We're not
'Cause I
speaking
think
for the African American race as a whole. We're speaking for our own opinions. So,
yeah, we're not speaking for everybody as a whole. We
mm-hmm.
understand there's different, and also we're not even talking about people who really are you know like Haitian American. We're not even
Mm-hmm.
talking about that kind of stuff. So that even gets more complex.
Yeah, we're
So
talking about African Americans who don't know what home is, like have no, and even to be fair, like your Haitians and your Caribbean individuals, a lot of them are taken from Africa too. So it could apply.
yeah, I'm just saying there's another layer because I think that they live somewhere else that was not like the American homeland. You know what I
Hmm.
mean? Or a
Yeah, which I
mainland
feel like they have a slight bit more cultural ties
to that. Yeah, I
to
agree.
Africa.
Think so? I was gonna say
I
to
think
their
so.
like islands.
Well, I think to their island, yeah, because I think they like made something of their own, but rooted from Africa. Like a lot of the things that they do are it's similar to African culture.
Yeah, yeah, it's probably closer.
Hmm.
But I also think a lot of the islands were also colonized by like Spanish people.
Hmm.
Um, not so much like, well, I guess Spanish is Europe, but so yeah, I guess
Yeah,
our
but I think
Europeans.
like the difference is like European, like white European versus like Spaniard. They had their own culture, and like those two things kind of merged.
Yeah,
Versus white
Spanish already
Americans were
culture
like
in Europe.
destroy. And you could say like Spanish
And
culture
also,
has some cultural ties to like Africa, you know? Like there's
yeah,
some
actually,
similarity there. Like I feel like some of the Spanish culture has already been taken from Africa.
also they're closer to the continent of Africa.
True. That
And
too.
I want to say there was something I was reading some story or something about like a Spaniard or there was something where it might have been Shakespeare or something, but like there's a black person or like prominent black figure in like one of those stories or something, and it was like tied to Spanish origin. I think I
Hmm.
could be wrong. I could be making that up, but yeah. I mean, this is really making me. This is really probing. I thought we were just gonna debate Black American, but now I'm really thinking about like honestly, white people are in the same position.
I feel like they're in
I
a
mean, I don't
slightly
want to say
different
not the
position,
same
but
position. I mean, okay, I don't want to say in the same position as like as far as the hierarchy is concerned. Obviously, they're privileged and they have created this mess, really. But what I'm saying is they are also in some ways lacking ties to a homeland.
I mean, I think in a manner of ways, sure. But I also think that the difference is white Americans can call America home. There is a whole society here. Even if you're not part of the elite white society or culture, you can still deem yourself white American and be okay. Even
It's,
even in
I
the
don't.
society of the unwanted white folk, you know what I mean? You are still okay as long as you are not black.
Yes, I think I'm gonna make a difference because I think what you're saying is not so much like home in a sense of like uh origin, but
Yeah.
home in a sense of it is a safe space for them because they've
Mhm.
created the privilege and the hierarchy to make it a safe
Mhm.
space for them. It is safe
Exactly.
for them to be white walking around versus they made it
Exactly.
not safe for everybody else. So I don't think
Exactly.
we're not talking about home in the sense of like
Mhm.
origin. This is where I come from, and there's a cultural, deep cultural ties and all of that. I think we're
Mhm.
talking about it's safe to be a white American in America because you are a white
Yeah.
person and that affords you a privilege. And they have
Exactly.
created that distinction
Mhm.
distinctly to make sure it
Mhm.
is safe for them and not everybody else.
Exactly. And that's what home is to me. So that's why I don't think African Americans have a home.
And maybe that, I mean, maybe that's how we're looking at like what are we defining as home? Because
Home.
when we think about home, we're thinking about home is a lot of different things. Home is a
Mhm.
safe space. Home is a
Mhm.
place of origin. It's a place I can
Mhm.
trace back to. It's a
Mhm.
place I can it's a foundational place. It's all those things, you know. And maybe
Mhm.
that's where our debate goes is because I'm thinking about home not so much as like a place of safety or like refuge,
Mhm.
but I'm thinking about home as like where does this direct I'm thinking about it as an origin. Where do we trace back linearly in time?
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
You know what I'm
Yeah.
saying?
No, it's
And so
beyond
that's
that for me.
and so that's why I think when I was saying like Black American culture or descendants of slavery, their culture is directly linearly tied back to the institution of slavery,
Sure.
time
And
wise.
even further than that, that is directly tied to Africa. So.
Yes, in some ways.
Mhm.
So I think it's really maybe what we've come to the conclusion that it is both, and it is all three, it is all four, it is all
Yeah.
of that,
I
it
think
is all
all of
of these
that could
things.
be true.
You know, and it's like this was taken from that, that was taken from that, but then also it was expanded upon, you know, or it was uh crafted in a way that makes it more usable for people here in America. You know what I mean? Um, and
Yeah.
maybe that's the beauty I'm looking at is that it takes a level of ingenuity, it takes a level of resilience, it takes a level of strength, it takes a level of forethought, it takes a lot of that I feel like our enslaved ancestors had to have in order to continue on with our generations, to pass down those folklore narratives, to pass down the music, the clothes, the hairstyles, even if they're taking it from Africa, there was something they had to be keepers of. They had to be ken keepers of, basically, in
Mhm.
order to pass it down so that it even gets to our grandmother and then her mother, our mother, and then to us in whatever iterations. And that's what I want to honor. That's what I'm saying. I want to honor. I want to honor the people who had to fight and endure, and like that takes an incredible amount of strength.
No, I hear that. I hear
Despite
that.
and that's what I mean by I want to celebrate that culture that they made, that
I hear
they
that.
created,
I
because
still
that is
have a
not
hard
that.
time wrapping my head around culture though, because it's like the brutality of it. It's like, can you really
Yeah,
call that culture?
I mean, and that's why I'm saying I always say it's a despite, and it's a sad, horrendous despite because we're talking about the institution of American slavery, and that's nothing to make light of at all in the slightest
Hmm.
bit. But I think though that is equally dismissive to say, well, you know what? We're not going to acknowledge that there was a fight, there was ingenuity, there was resilience, there was something endured, and I want to honor that as well as acknowledging the atrocities.
Mm, yeah, I guess.
It's
Uh,
like I mean, all I can think is like it's like our mother. It's like she's both. She is both of these things. She's somebody who suffered, and she's somebody who endured.
I mean, I hear that. I think a lot of that is even rooted in the brutality. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like a lot of that is also trauma, a response from all of those things that have never been dealt with. So, I don't know.
I agree, but I want to acknowledge the parts. I think it's dismissive to say to not acknowledge the strength too.
No, I want to acknowledge it. I just don't know. Like, I think using the word culture can be harmful. That's all. Like, if there was another word for it, um, I think that would be a more useful term, or maybe like, I mean, I couldn't say detaching Black culture from slavery either, though. So I don't know.
That's what I'm saying. There's, you hate to say it, but it's this really dark, sick, kind of effed up symbiotic, not even symbiotic, I guess parasitic
Mm-hmm.
relationship where there is no such thing, in my opinion, as Black American culture without the institution of slavery.
I don't know. That's why I don't feel like I'm qualified to speak on it.
I mean, because when the timeline starts. You know what I'm saying?
I don't agree. I think the timeline starts in Africa. That's just a tick on the
Well,
timeline.
I'm talking about people who were direct descendants of slavery system. So people whose
But
parents
I disagree. That's what I'm saying.
either like were born into the American system of slavery.
But I'm saying I disagree with that. Like, I feel like the origin is Africa. Like, it is African Americans. Sure, that culture may have like started here in America, but your origins go back to Africa. Period.
I think some of the origins do.
I mean, I think
But
African American. I think all origin probably goes back to Africa.
yeah.
So,
I mean,
like, if you want to
the
be
first people
specific,
ever were like first signs of human life were in Africa. That's like been
exactly.
noted. So that's not really a like debate.
Yeah, but that's
And
like I think that like it's beyond the. I don't think it had like obviously it didn't just start when we came to America. Like, there's a history before that, and I think that needs to be understood as well.
yes, I agree. I'm not saying that we don't need to understand African like the history of African nations and even going back and finding like our direct roots to Africa, right? But I think, you know, I think there just needs to be appreciation of both because something did come out of that rupture. That's that institution of slavery. Something came out of it, right? And that's what we are living proof of. Just like the African nations now have continued to keep their culture, their nationality going, and they have had ruptures as well, you know? So I think dismissing any of it is a shame, you know. And I think too much in American culture, we look at we look at what I call to be Black American culture as this sort of like, well, you don't know where you come from. You're just this lost person in the woods. You don't have a homeland. You have no ties, and so because you have no real quote ties, that it's not to be um taken with a level of severity. It's not to be appreciated. It's not to be, you know, celebrated. And I think it's false. I just think it's false to act like there is no tie there. There is a tie, you know? So, but
Interesting combo.
yeah, all right. But we could talk about this longer. Maybe eventually we'll do another debate or something. But
I feel like we should get
uh,
some people of other ethnicities to
yeah, I
come
agree.
in and communicate their opinions on the matter.
That, and I also think we should read some more like scholarly articles on the matter
Sure.
and stuff. People who have studied this versus just our opinions. I think we
Mm-hmm.
should also state again, this is our opinions, okay? We're not speaking for
Mm-hmm.
Black culture. We're not speaking for white people. We're not speaking for anybody but ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And we are Black American women, and we do come from the South. So, you know, we grew up around what I consider to be our Black Americans' like homeland. Um, so, and there are vestiges of slavery everywhere where we grew up, you know? So, yeah.
Let us know what you think in the comments. I would love to hear other people's opinion about this matter. Because I
Yeah.
think depending on, your different ties to maybe Caribbeans, to Africa maybe, or white Americans and being European or not European and those things like that and how you connect it. Share with us your thoughts because I would love to have that conversation and get different people's opinion on the matter. Maybe we could do another episode with a guest. But
Yeah, that would be good. I'm going to see if one of my friends wants to do it because she's a biracial person.
mm-hmm.
And you know some biracial people too, right?
No, I have some friends that are they're like Caribbean.
Okay, that could be good.
Mm-hmm. And they're also like lighter skin Caribbean, so I wonder if that changes the perspective too.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Because I think how you appear in this world definitely changes things.
Yeah, I agree.
But yeah, maybe we can do an episode on colorism too. Like how do you navigate the world as?
That's like I just feel like that's a whole other debate. That's
Oh
like
no,
not even
100%.
that's not
That's
even
an
a culture.
interesting one. Yeah, no, that has nothing to do with culture. That's just purely
that's
color.
like hierarchy, color, like you get into so many things. I'm like, that
Yeah.
would be a 4-hour conversation.
For sure. It might be like a 5-parter, but
Yeah,
hey.
for sure. Maybe this could be an ongoing series. We kind of delve into like what is our culture, and we can show some things about, show off things that are about our culture, or I don't say show off things, but like explain things that we consider to be culture.
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting concept.
Could be interesting. Anyway, we're gonna wrap up the episode there. Thank you guys for listening. We hope you were able to engage. I know we did. And yeah, I guess we'll see you guys in the next one. Bye, everybody.
Bye.